A New York Times investigation is bringing the president's past back into light. The report uncovered evidence that two doctors from Queens, New York, helped the president dodge the Vietnam War in 1968.
Dr. Larry Bronstein was a podiatrist who rented a medical office from the president's father, Fred Trump Sr. Bronstein's daughter says that her father diagnosed Trump with bone spurs as a favor to Fred so that he wouldn't have to go fight. So joining us now is the investigative reporter for this article, Steve Eder. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. When this popped up on sort of my news feed, I thought, oh man, this is such an interesting thing. And you guys at the New York Times have been really relentless in kind of picking apart and some of the things that the president has said about his past. So set the stage for us, though. You know, who was Donald Trump at this time? Had he graduated from military college? Was he likely to go to Vietnam? Was he a candidate?
Yeah, so this
Not
is
military
50
college,
years
sorry,
ago.
military high school, military
Valley
high
Forge,
school.
Valley Forge,
Yeah.
Military high school.
Yeah.
It was 1968. He was fresh out of University of Pennsylvania, with the Wharton program, and here he is. It's a big point in the Vietnam War. And he was, that summer after graduation, he was declared available for service, called to get his exam done. And at that point, what the records show and what the history shows is that he was ultimately given a medical exemption, a temporary medical exemption. And that's where my reporting kind of picked up, was trying to sort of delve into the history of that.
So let me just read what the campaign said when the president was then candidate Trump about those bone spurs. It said this: while attending the University of Pennsylvania's prestigious Wharton School of Finance, Mr. Trump received a minor medical deferment for bone spurs on both heels of his feet. The medical deferment was expected to be short-term, and he was therefore entered in the military draft lottery, where he received an extremely high number, 356 out of 365. What's your takeaway from that statement?
Yeah, well, I think that we've, in the time since that statement and around that time, we've been able to fill in some of the historical blanks there. I mean, one key point is that the medical exemption was actually, listed in 1968, the fall of 1968. The lottery didn't begin until the end of 1969. So there was a period there of over a year where regardless of the lottery, there was a medical exception that was already in place. And there's a lot of factors that went in. He had already had 4 education deferments during the college years, which was fairly typical for an undergraduate student during that time. But then the next phase got into, well, what else is there that would keep somebody out of the war? And one of the things that people looked for were medical exemptions.
So you said it was fairly typical to get an exemption for being in college. How typical is something like this? It's a sort of low-grade medical exemption.
I mean, certainly medical exemptions were a big part of the picture for people in this era. People who, if you had a medical issue of varying degrees, they could lead to exceptions from, during Vietnam, from service. And there were plenty of examples of people. There's been, plenty of people who have gone through that, down that path, including prominent people, politicians, and others. And for somebody who's, a president or running for president, public office, these service records always tend to be, especially for men of the Vietnam era, something that we look at.
The president also said in an interview with ABC News that he had this minor medical deferment for feet, I'm quoting him here, for a bone spur of the foot. I was fortunate in a sense because I was not a believer in the Vietnam War. What did you uncover in terms of how he was able to get this medical deferment for those bone spurs?
Well, that's what we've sort of focused on here, was trying to get a little bit deeper into that history. And I had written about this a couple of years ago during the campaign, and he had told me during an interview then that he had gotten a letter, a very solid letter that he had presented to the draft officials at his exam. And what we learned here was the more about the doctor and the role behind it, from this story, this family story in the Bronstein family, about a tip that had come through for me recently, led me to the Bronsteins and to their story about what their father had told them over the years about his being a tenant for Fred Trump, as held his office in a building owned by Fred Trump, and how he had provided this essentially as a favor to Fred Trump. That's what the Bronstein family
Dr. Bronstein has passed away. So you are relying on the stories from his family members. Were you able to verify that beyond what his family members said he said to them?
Yeah, and so the story, in large part, is based on the accounts of the two adult daughters of Dr. Bronstein. Dr. Bronstein passed away in 2007, and both of his daughters had recollections of these discussions and sort of this idea of this family lore over the years of their father talking about what he had done, in terms of the help that he provided for this famous person, for a young Donald Trump at the time, and for his father. There was not documentation to back up. This is 50 years ago. A lot of the records that relate to the Vietnam era and the medical exams are no longer. And so the account was based on those two. It's a possible explanation for what took place.
Right, because in your piece you talk about the fact that Dr. Larry Bronstein, and as you pointed out, he died in 2007. His daughter says she knows that, or she felt that it was a favor to the president's father, Fred Trump, to provide this letter. But you haven't been able to uncover the documentation that actually suggests that, but it could have been a conversation that Fred Trump Sr. had with the doctor because he was the landlord of that building.
Yeah, there's still quite a few unknowns here. I mean, and it's one of those things where, as you sort of trace back in 50 years of history, there are still some unknowns, and I think in the piece we make that clear. But yeah, there's certainly a relationship between Fred Trump and Dr. Larry Bronstein. Larry Bronstein rented his office there for decades from the Trumps, and essentially what Bronstein's daughters told me is that he got an attentive landlord out of this. He was able to get somebody that if there was a problem in the building, if there was something that he needed, the Trumps took care of it. And there was another podiatrist who had gotten to know Dr. Bronstein, recounted a story of other help with rent and things like that that would come up over the years with trying to back off rent increases and things of that nature. So it was one of those things where it was a landlord tenant relationship, and this came about in the 1960s.
Hey, Steve, during the campaign, when this topic came up, there were a lot of sort of jokes or memes being cracked about how the president's such an avid golfer and what happened to his bone spurs, if he has them, because he seems to be able to walk a lot. Has he been inconsistent with his explanation?
Well, there's been a sort of various explanations that he's sort of given over the years. The point about the lottery and the high draft lottery number was certainly a big point that's come up. He's also, discussed the bone spurs, at various times, discussed them as being a very minor issue. When you look at him at 22 years old, he was very athletic. He was somebody who, played multiple sports as a young man. And so, the history of those bone spurs questions about which foot and things like that's come up and kind of been one of those things that have sort of followed him as part of this story over the last few years.
Steve Eder, thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.